In August 2019, the United States Department of Justice unsealed an indictment against Claver Alcalá Cordones, a Venezuelan army general who had served under Hugo Chavez and remained a senior figure in Nicolas Maduro's military establishment. The indictment accused Alcalá of conspiring to import cocaine into the United States, not as a corrupt individual enriching himself on the side, but as a representative of what the indictment described as a narco-terrorist conspiracy operating at the level of the Venezuelan state itself. Alcalá eventually surrendered to U.S. authorities and pleaded guilty. In his plea, he confirmed what U.S. prosecutors had been documenting for years, that Venezuela's cocaine trafficking was not a problem the government was trying to solve. It was a revenue stream the government was actively managing. This is not a story about corruption. Corruption implies deviation from a norm. What we are examining in this video is something categorically different. States where the government itself has become the primary drug trafficking organization, where the logistics, the protection, the financial infrastructure, and sometimes the production of narcotics is organized at the level of the state, using state resources, state personnel, and the legal immunities that sovereignty provides. The narco state is not a state that has failed to control drug trafficking. It is a state that has chosen to become it. Three countries illustrate this at scale: Venezuela, Myanmar, and North Korea. They share almost nothing in terms of geography, culture, or political ideology. What they share is the same calculation, that the revenues available from state-level drug trafficking, protected by sovereign immunity and conducted through state infrastructure, exceed what any conventional alternative can generate in the constrained economic environments they inhabit. And that the international community's ability to hold a sovereign state accountable for drug trafficking is fundamentally limited in ways that its ability to hold a cartel accountable is not. Venezuela's transformation into a narco-state began in the Chavez era and accelerated under Maduro as oil revenues collapsed. Venezuela sits at the northern tip of South America, positioned between Colombia, the world's largest cocaine producer, and the Atlantic Ocean, with Caribbean island chains providing ideal transshipment points toward Europe and the United States. The organization that exploited this geography most effectively is known as the Cartel of the Suns, El Cartel de los Soles, named for the sun insignia worn on Venezuelan military generals' uniforms. It is not a cartel in the conventional sense. It is a network of active and retired Venezuelan military officers, senior government officials, and their civilian partners who collectively manage the movement of Colombian cocaine through Venezuelan territory, ports, and airspace. The scale of Venezuelan cocaine transshipment is substantial. According to U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration estimates, somewhere between 200 and 250 metric tons of cocaine pass through Venezuela annually, roughly 15 to 20% of total global cocaine supply reaching international markets. The logistics involve Venezuelan military and police personnel providing security escorts for drug shipments, Venezuelan Air Force personnel facilitating the use of Venezuelan airspace and airstrips, Venezuelan Navy assets accompanying shipments through Caribbean waters, and Venezuelan ports processing containers with narcotics concealed among legitimate cargo. The payments flow back through a combination of cash, gold, and wire transfers routed through front companies in jurisdictions including Panama, Andorra, and the UAE. The Maduro government's involvement extends beyond tolerance of military trafficking. In 2020, the United States Department of Justice indicted Maduro himself, along with the President of the Venezuelan National Assembly, the head of Venezuelan military intelligence, and multiple other senior officials on narco-terrorism charges. The indictment alleged a decades-long conspiracy with the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, to use cocaine trafficking as a geopolitical weapon aimed at flooding the United States with drugs. Whether or not Maduro is ever brought to trial, the indictment documents with specificity meetings, communications, and transactions that describe a state-level narcotics trafficking operation coordinated at the executive level. Myanmar represents a different model, where Venezuela is primarily a transshipment state, moving cocaine produced elsewhere. Myanmar is a production state. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous borderlands where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converge, has been one of the world's primary opium and heroin-producing regions since the mid-20th century. After the military coup of February 2021, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar's drug production underwent a transformation. Opium production, already substantial, expanded dramatically. Myanmar surpassed Afghanistan as the world's largest opium producer in 2023 by some estimates. But the more significant shift was in synthetic drugs. The borderlands of northern Myanmar are home to multiple ethnic armed organizations that have operated semi-autonomously for decades: the United West State Army, the Kokang Region Forces, the National Democratic Alliance Army. Under the post-coup military government, these organizations expanded methamphetamine production at a scale the region had never seen before. Myanmar has become the primary source of methamphetamine flooding Southeast Asia and increasingly East Asia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, China, and Australia. The Mekong River Basin serves as the primary distribution corridor. The pills, known as yaba in the regional market, are produced in factories operating openly in areas under the effective control of armed groups that have mutually beneficial relationships with the Tatmadaw, Myanmar's military. The military government receives revenue, the armed groups receive protection, and the product moves. The financial relationship between the Tatmadaw and the drug-producing borderland militias is not new. It predates the 2021 coup by decades. What changed after the coup is the scale and the degree of state-level coordination. International isolation following the coup, combined with the collapse of Myanmar's legitimate economy and the flight of foreign investment, has made drug revenue increasingly central to the military government's fiscal position. It is, in the assessment of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the most significant expansion of synthetic drug production capacity in Asia's recorded history, and it is happening under the direct patronage of a government that controls the country's military, its ports, and its border crossings. The money from Myanmar's synthetic drug industry moves through a network of Chinese banking intermediaries, cryptocurrency wallets, and hawala brokers operating across the Thai-Myanmar and China-Myanmar borders. The United West State Army, the largest of the borderland militias with an estimated 30,000 fighters, has built what researchers describe as a parallel financial state, with its own banking system, its own real estate industry in the city of Pangsang, and cash flows from methamphetamine revenue that dwarf the official GDP of the territory it controls. The Tatmadaw's tolerance of this parallel economy is not passive indifference. It is a deliberate revenue-sharing arrangement in a country where the military government has lost access to most legitimate sources of international finance. North Korea represents the most deliberate and systematized version of state narcotics trafficking. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the economic catastrophe of the 1990s famine, the Kim regime developed what scholars of North Korean political economy describe as state trading companies, Bureau Fair 9 being the most frequently cited, that operated under the direct supervision of the Korean Workers' Party to generate hard currency revenue outside any legitimate trade framework. Drug production and trafficking was one of Bureau Fair 9's primary revenue lines. North Korean diplomats stationed in multiple countries were documented trafficking heroin and methamphetamine using diplomatic pouches that could not be searched under international law. North Korean naval vessels were intercepted with drug cargoes. North Korean state laboratories were, according to defector testimony and U.S. intelligence assessments, producing pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine at industrial scale. The North Korean methamphetamine operation evolved through the 1990s and 2000s in response to market conditions and interdiction pressure. When diplomatic trafficking became too risky following multiple high-profile diplomatic drug busts, the regime shifted toward using private Chinese and Japanese criminal networks as distribution partners. The product moved from North Korean production facilities through Chinese intermediaries into East Asian markets, with proceeds returned to the regime through financial channels including the Macau-based Banco Delta Asia, which the U.S. Treasury designated as a primary money laundering concern in 2005. The drug revenue generated by the North Korean state at peak is estimated at somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion annually, a significant fraction of total regime revenue, and all of it inaccessible to conventional sanctions. What connects Venezuela, Myanmar, and North Korea is a structural logic that applies whenever a state is sufficiently sanctioned, sufficiently desperate for hard currency, and sufficiently insulated from international accountability. Drug trafficking, unlike almost any other illicit revenue source, scales with state resources rather than against them. A state that controls borders can protect shipments. A state that controls ports can embed narcotics in legitimate container traffic. A state that controls airspace can fly drug cargoes without interception. A state that maintains diplomatic posts can use pouches and personnel that cannot be searched. Sovereign immunity is for a narco-state the most valuable operational asset a drug trafficking organization can possess. The international community's tools for addressing state-level drug trafficking are significantly weaker than its tools for addressing cartel-level trafficking. Cartels can be infiltrated, their leaders extradited, their financial networks traced and disrupted. A sovereign government cannot be extradited. Its senior officials cannot be arrested in their own territory. Its infrastructure cannot be raided. The mechanisms that exist, sanctions, asset freezes, indictments issued speculatively, generate diplomatic friction without producing operational disruption. Maduro remains in power. The Tatmadaw continues to govern Myanmar. The Kim regime continues to produce and export narcotics at scale. The indictments exist. The drug trafficking continues. What the narco-state ultimately reveals is the same structural gap that appears in every episode of this series. The global financial and legal system was built to regulate entities that operate within it. States that choose to operate outside it, that are willing to accept the cost of international isolation in exchange for the revenue and operational freedom that sovereignty provides, exist in a space the system was not designed to reach. The deeper pattern across all three countries is this. Each became a narco-state not primarily because of cultural or moral failure, but because of a specific economic calculation made at a specific moment of crisis. Venezuela chose narco revenue as oil collapsed and sanctions tightened. Myanmar's military chose it as investment fled and international banking access disappeared after the coup. North Korea chose it as the Soviet subsidies that had sustained the regime ended with the Soviet Union itself. In each case, the state concluded that the revenues available from drug trafficking, multiplied by the operational advantages that sovereignty provides, exceeded what any legitimate alternative could generate in their constrained circumstances. Understanding narco-states requires understanding not just the corruption that enables them, but the economic logic that creates them. That logic does not disappear when a particular regime does. It reappears wherever the same conditions, isolation, collapse, legitimate revenue, and a sovereign territory to operate from, converge again.